lecture. Friends, as yesterday we have seen that how Aristotle, talking about Homeric poems, and he mentioned it very clearly in Homeric poems that Homeric poems are direct with a direct speech, and therefore Homeric poems represent the highest possible development of epic, but also disclose a potential which cannot be fully realized when the constraints of narrative forms in Homeric poems. So, to overcome with those constraints, Homer pointed out towards drama. And in Aristotle's view, drama was subsequent development, a separate development of poetry. His hypothesis is that it originated as an adaptation of improvisatory poetic forms. And this improvisatory poetic forms in which a soloist leading the whole narration and responded to a chorus. Please understand, this is what a format of an epic is going on, because the person who is leading the whole narration of epic, making it in simple, common, routine way, that there's a lead singer who used to sing all those things, and rest of the lines are sung by chorus standing behind. Now, this singing of epic by the lead singer who is singing that particular epic, and the other person's, the chorus, is afterwards singing those same lines. Now, if you understand this idea of lead singer and chorus singing it, now this distinction between chorus and chorus leader, distinction between chorus and chorus leader, it opens up a possibility of dialogue, because one is singing and then rest of them are responding to the words sung by the leader, that is chorus leader is singing that and chorus is responding to it. This develops a possibility of dialogues, and you will find out, as there is a possibility of dialogue, then there is an absolute chance of drama to come out of it, because as we have seen it in last year, that dialogue is one of the major elements of drama. Now, the leader in epic, or the leader who used to lead the whole epic, chorus leader, it can be converted into, or he became the first actor in the history of Greek drama. And as the poets perceived and increasingly they exploited the dramatic possibilities, because when chorus leader is leading and the response the chorus is giving to its leader, as I said, there are lots of possibility of dialogues, and these dramatic possibilities have been exploited, and try to write down spoken words, dialogues, where the number of actors can be increased slowly. The number of actors can be increased from 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and the chorus is declining, and later on the importance of chorus is getting away. Now, as we have seen all this development of actor or characters and declining of chorus, as we have studied it in the development of drama, that how drama developed from Greek to modern, how this drama changes its own writing style, you will find out that during Aristotelian days also, although Greek tragedy is having one of its major contribution in the forms of use of chorus. Chorus is used there as one of the major form of performances. And that's why we have to understand that during Aristotle's days also, you may find that the importance of the chorus had declined more than Aristotle thought it as an appropriate. The number of chorus used in epic, because epic is sung by chorus and chorus leaders, and when the number of chorus, the number in the chorus is more, but when it is converted into actors or characters in drama, the number started decreasing, and Aristotle even appreciated the decreasing number in the whole chorus. But what he thought, that the decline is more than what he thought. And that's why you will find out that Aristotle, looking at a poetry, or Aristotle sees the history of poetry as a development towards the great coherence in plot structure. And this plot structure, development in plot structure, and this development in poetry is also leading towards, you can say, more truly the imitative dramatic mode. Because poets are finding that it has got all the possibilities to use an imitative dramatic mode to express. So when all these elements Aristotle is looking at, there are certain dichotomies. The dichotomy between the imitation of admirable and inferior agents and activities which Aristotle assumes was present in the earliest poetry remains as it is, remains constant. It has not changed. Because when you are writing drama, or when your poetry has been converted into the form of drama, then it is somehow expected that the inferior agents and their activities has to curtail down. But when the poets started exploring the possible dramatic activity through their poems, the inferior agents, the imitation of inferior agents and activities It remains as it is, as it was part of poetry. So, chapter number 2 of Poetics explained its theoretical rationale and pointed out that it can be observed to persist throughout the history of poetry. Throughout the history of poetry, you can find out all these types of things are taking place. Praise poems are balanced by lampoons, or heroic epic balanced by narrative burlesque, tragedy by comedy. So you will find out that there is always a balance in the form of understanding of, or to follow the idea, a development of the whole poetry to drama. So that throughout the history of poetry, you will find out there are a balancing act. And that's why you'll find out if it is a tragedy, then there is comedy also. It is pointing out what tragedy wants to speak about. Comedy is doing something it in a different form, different way. Epic is been heroic epic used to explain the deeds of hero, whereas narrative burlesque used to point out a satirical approach towards all these things. That means it tried to balance the whole imitation that we find it in the society. Very interestingly, poetics largely concentrates on tragedy. Although, for giving a theoretical rationale, he said there are always two things in the society. When you are saying it is good, there are bad also. When it is black, there is white also, to balance the social equilibrium. If you want to balance it, you require something always in the society which is been imitated. But if you go through poetics, you will find that Aristotle largely talking on tragedy rather than giving chance to rest of the things that he has initiated in his first 4, 5, 6 chapters. Why? What makes Aristotle not to have a consistent debate or consistent argument to continued with the sort of debate or arguments that he put in the form of tragedy to its reader? The answer you can get it, my friends, that all the editors who have edited Aristotle's Poetics, as I said you in my first lecture, also that Aristotle's Poetics is not in itself a complete text, because it is translated and we are reading translation. Because as I said, the old classical Greek literature was burned down, and whatever things are remaining, the editors had compiled it and presented it in the form of poetics to us. That's why it may be possible that Aristotle wrote more words on comedy, more words on epic, but we find there are few comments in poetics about comedy and about epic. And that's why you will find out, my friend, that epic is given relatively brief treatment as a pendant to tragedy. And a full discussion of comedy is promised somewhere in poetics, but the promise is not fulfilled, so that you can say that these various indications used to point out that the text that we have in our hands is incomplete in itself. That what Aristotle going through the history of poetry, making it, taking it to the notion of tragedy, and trying to point out that it reaches, it explored, the poets explored the possibility of dramatic mode into their writings, and that's why dramatic possibilities of spoken dialogue leads to writing drama, and poets are interested in writing tragedies. Now, in analyzing the tragedy, the framework for the analysis of tragedy, Aristotle has set this in his chapter number 6 of Poetics. A very famous definition of tragedy, which we know it very well, which we discussed in our last year's lecture of drama when we talked about tragedy. I'm not going to discuss once again the same sort of definition, but we have definition of tragedy stated by Aristotle in this sixth chapter. And from this, Aristotle deduces the constituent parts of tragedy. And after this definition, he ranks these constituents in order of importance. He gave order of importance, that what are the things important for tragedy. And in that, as we know it very well, that he gave primacy to plot. Plot is one of the most important part in any tragedy, as we know it very well. We have discussed a lot in the last year's second semester. As I'm saying it right from the beginning of our discussion regarding to the poetics, that Aristotle used to point out that tragedy, like all the poetry, is an imitation. And specifically, it is an imitation of certain kind of action. So one constituent part of tragedy is plot. As we know, plot is mean by action. And the ordered sequence of events which make up the action being imitated. Now, action is performed by agents, and the agents necessarily have moral and intellectual characteristics expressed in what they do and say. Now, from this, that an action is performed by agents, and agents necessarily have moral and intellectual characteristics expressed in what they do and say. From this, we can deduce that character and reasoning will also be constituent parts of tragedy. Please get it down that what are the constituent parts of tragedy? Primary thing is plot, action. Then character and reasoning will also be the constituent parts of tragedy. And to see what Aristotle means by these two terms, character and reasoning. Imagine that you have left as a situation that you are having a dinner in a hotel where you are sitting there for a dinner, and the dinner is served to you, and after that dinner is over there are silver spoons kept there and nobody is there. Now, broadly speaking, there are going to be two factors working there simultaneously. What are those two factors? Whether or not you will steal them, whether you will steal those silver spoons, whether you will not steal the silver spoons. These are the only two possibilities. If I'm honest, and if I'm honest, I'll go with the first determination that I'll not steal it. Now, Aristotle is trying to point out that this is what is mean by character. Character is actually an agent who is settled with a moral disposition. Now, the other relevant factor is how I interpret the situation. Again, in the same situation, do I think that I'm likely to avoid the suspicion if I take the spoons? What would happen? What we think, what would I think? Now, this thinking, please understand this. Because you are honest, you will not steal the spoons. This is what, because why you are honest? Because you are morally very strong. And that is what character he is expecting, that the character he means by this, that who is having a morally strong position. Now interpret this thing with other relevant factor, that if I'm perceiving this, if I'm thinking about it, how will I perceive it? Whether a thought is coming in my mind that shall I steal it? Shall I take it with me? Is the thought coming in my mind? And if I'm thinking that I'm likely to avoid the suspicion, that you started to think that okay, there's a suspicion in the mind of this particular person that I'll steal the spoons, that's why he's looking at me in that way. The suspicion is in the mind of that person that you will steal that spoon, and you are interpreting the situation by yourself. You don't know why that particular XYZ is looking at you. This Aristotle means by reasoning. You started reasoning about the thing that okay, I'm sitting in front of a silver spoons, and what this person will think about it, whether I'll steal it. Now you are building up your own reasons for that. You are building up your own understanding for that. No, I'll not do it because I'm honest. You are having your own reason for that, why you are not doing it. And Aristotle means by reasoning in this way of the character. And that's why you can draw to one conclusion that if I am dishonest and reason, that I can get away with those spoons. I'm likely to steal the spoons. Now, to use a phrase that recurs persistently throughout the poetics, this phrase is persistently coming in poetics. That yesterday we have a passing remarks on that, and the phrase is necessity, necessary, or probable. This is the phrase that you will find out is continuously discussed in poetics. That I'll steal the spoon if I am dishonest and think I can get away with it. Because dishonesty necessarily leads you to take that thing. And why you are taking that thing is a probability that you are dishonest, not confused. So Aristotle is pointing out that character sets an agenda. What would, for example, you are a character. What would I like to do? Character sets it. This was decided by characters. Character sets his own agenda. And reasoning relates to that particular agenda. Reasoning relates to that particular agenda to a given situation. Because if the situation is that somebody is standing in front of you, you will not steal it. But if you are alone and thinking and feeling that I should steal it because I'm dishonest, in that situation, the reasoning is somehow different because it depends on situation, it depends on the circumstances. And that's why every character in drama, every character in tragedy sets up his own agenda that what he is going to do. And for for completing that agenda, for completing the task of agenda, there are certain reasons that has been created by him with a particular situation. And that's why these two words, character and reasoning, they are the constituents, major constituents, or major constituent parts of tragedy. That means plot, character, and reasoning. These three things relate to object of tragic imitation. These three things relate to the object of tragic imitation. Now please understand, yesterday what we talked about, medium, object, and mode. These are the three words. What is the medium of tragedy? Medium of tragedy is its rhythmical language. Sometimes it has its own rhythmical language, or sometimes a melody is accompanied to it. Now please remember, my friends, that what I am or what Aristotle is discussing is related to the Greek writings. Now, don't relate it with modern drama, don't relate it with later on dramas, because somehow later on drama, these are the basic things, these are the major things, but somehow, some way it has been deviated later on. So, it has a restriction. You please understand this fact that when you are analyzing Aristotle's ideas of tragedy through poetics, you have to understand that Aristotle has written all those things after observing, after knowing, after you can say watching the great tragedians of the time. So he has his own context. And that's why what Aristotle is talking about, the medium of tragedy is rhythmical language. If you are saying that, sir, I'm looking at a modern tragedy, if I'm looking at death of a salesman, how can I find a rhythmical language there? There is no rhythmical language. That's why I'm saying please restrict it to you to the tragedies that Aristotle has mentioned it in from Greek literature only. And that's why the medium of tragedy is rhythmical language. And this rhythmical language sometimes has its own rhythm or accompanied by certain melodies sometimes. Now, this medium gives us two further constituents of tragedy: diction and lyric poetry. Because if its medium is rhythmical language, it requires that sort of diction, and because it has got rhythm, it requires two lyrics. So these are the two different, another two constituents added into it. The first one is plot, second is character, third is reasoning, fourth is diction, fifth is lyric poetry. Because the spoken part in tragedy deals with the sort of diction you use into it. And the singing part, which the plays verbal text, you can call it, requires lyrical poetry. So diction and lyrical poetry, they are two more constituents of tragedy. Now, the medium of tragedy is rhythmical language. Tragedy is poetic imitation in dramatic mode. We have seen it yesterday also. Tragedy is poetic imitation in dramatic mode. Medium is language, rhythmical language. Mode is dramatic mode. Why? Because it is designed to be acted out on the stage. That is the important condition. Unfortunately, we are reading dramas, but actually, drama requires to be performed on the stage. When it is being performed on the stage, where the action, please understand, there is a difference between the action in epic and action in tragedy. Action in epic is narrated, sung by the chorus leader, and the chorus is responding to that particular action. Whereas in tragedy, the action has to be acted out on the stage. And you can see that grandeur of the hero fighting and the hero involved in action. The characters are performing actions. The actions are somehow having a lots of things added into it. That gives you a sort of different spectacle to your eyes because it is seen. It is seen on the stage. And that's why you can say, my friends, that tragedy includes its another constituents as spectacle. This is the sixth constituent we are talking about. Action or plot, character and reasoning, these three. Fourth is diction. Fifth is lyric poetry. Sixth is spectacle. Now, spectacle, most of the time, editors or critics used to say that the conventional, the translation of that word is conventional or unsatisfactory, because spectacle has some different meaning. That's why the translation of what Aristotle used it in his original Greek language, this translation of spectacle is not that much satisfactory, because what you are watching, what you are looking on the stage, you look everything that is visible on the stage. It is not simply uh, restricted to its striking effects. You watch everything on the stage. Everything is visible to you on the stage. And that visibility is what Aristotle is saying, it is part of your tragedy. It has to be acted out on the stage. So spectacle has some different meaning, but most of the critics have objection for the translation of that particular word, which is used in Greek. Even what the word is used in Greek, we are not familiar with it. Now we must be cautious here, my friends, that a tragedy is a poem. Tragedy is a poem, not a performance. A little bit cautious. That's why I said tragedy is a poem, but not a performance. A tragedy, which, for whatever reasons, whatever reasons it may be, if it is never performed, is no less a tragedy. That means performance is the essential part of tragedy. If tragedy is not performed, it is a poem. And that's why when we had started to discuss about drama in last semester, I discussed, I think you remember it very well, that tragedy or drama requires performance on the stage. And if the stage is not provided, then there is a big question mark whether to call it as drama or not. And that's what Aristotle is also underlining and mentioning it very categorically, that tragedy is a poem if not performed on the stage. A tragedy may be good, but its performance can be botched, because performance is not in the hands of the writer. Performance is related with the actors. Maybe the tragedy in a written form may be good, written accordingly what the framework requires, carrying all the constituents part required to prove it as a tragedy. Plot, character, reasoning, diction, lyric, poetry, spectacle, everything is there in that particular tragedy. But if the performance is botched, then we can say that tragedy is not good. So, what is actually seen by the given audience on a given occasion is incidental to the play as such. And that's why we discussed that in the last lectures of drama, in last year's lectures of drama, that the performance, that how that writing is, because spectacle is part of a tragedy in the sense that tragedy is potentially performable. That's why spectacle is part of tragedy, because it has capacity of performance. So poet, what Aristotle is saying, what Aristotle is mentioning, that it is essential that what he's claiming, the poet has a duty to ensure that his text can be performed without any visual absurdity. That is the duty of a poet. That it is not a responsibility of any other person. This is the difference in modern tragedy and in Greek and Elizabethan tragedy. In modern tragedy, you have got one person called director who is getting to know that what poet has written, what dramatist has written. He is following the rules and regulations and trying to give justice to what is right. But in Greek tragedies, but in Elizabethan tragedies, it is the duty of the poet to ensure that there should not be any absurdity in performance, in visual absurdity. And what Aristotle cryptically mentions that poets usually fail to achieve this. However, the actual realization of his text is in visible stage action. Now, what visible stage action is going on is not poet's responsibility. Poet has ensured that, okay, the visible absurdity is not in my performance. But when the performance is going on, at that time, if some actor, if some character commits certain error, then in that case it's not responsibility of the poet because it is not a visual absurdity. It is a mistake of that actor. So it is not poet's responsibility. That is what Aristotle is mentioning. It is not poet's responsibility. It is the responsibility of the stage manager, or in today's word, you can say director. And that's why it is not surprising that Aristotle, by the end of chapter 6, rates spectacle as the least important part of tragedy's constituents. That's why it is on sixth position. Least important part of tragedy constituents, because it is not in the hands of the poet. He'll ensure in his writing that there is going to be spectacle in that particular visibility, that everybody can able to watch out certain things that I'm trying to project. There is possible visibility, but it is not responsibility. And that's why you will find out that Aristotle is very categorically trying to give different constituents of tragedy. I'll repeat once again those six constituents. The most primary constituent of tragedy is plot, then character, then reasoning. What is reasoning? Reasoning is a relative thing to the agenda set by the character, that what sort of action he is going to take place. That is reasoning. What is why character is important? Because character should have a moral disposition to perform that particular action. That is part of plot, because in all these things, action is the most important part. And that's why you will find out Aristotle is talking about this particular action is the most important part of any tragedy. Primary part of tragedy is action, character, reasoning, then diction. Because diction requires the verse, that that non-lyrical part, that is part of the tragedy, requires a proper diction that is reached to the audience. Why diction is important? Because it has to convey what it wants to say in a very proper words, and that's why diction is one of the most important part. And what is lyric poetry. The fifth part is part of singing the song. Sixth important constituent, but having a very least position in tragedy, is spectacle. Because spectacle means the things which are visible to the audience. Why spectacle is important? Why spectacle is part of constituents? Why spectacle appears in the list of these six? The reason is that if the spectacle is not part of this whole process, then the tragedy would not be called it as a dramatic, or would not carry the dramatic mode. It will be considered as poetry. Because spectacle is the important part. Why spectacle is important part? Because it is expected, it is said that tragedy has to be acted out on the stage. If tragedy is being acted out on the stage, then and then it is possible to call it as tragedy. And what sort of spectacle is expected? What is the duty of the poet? To ensure that there should not be any sort of visual absurdity. It is the responsibility of the poet to ensure that there is no visible absurdity. But if there is an error, there is a mistake in a visible stage action, an action is taking place on the stage, at that time if there is certain absurdity, then it is not poet's responsibility, it is the responsibility of the stage manager or director in modern words. As this is not in the hands of poet to carry on this, Aristotle gives least important to this least importance to this very pertinent constituent of tragedy called spectacle. So these are the six major constituents of tragedy. Now, moving ahead with the sort of analysis that Aristotle is trying to bring out with what he talks about the verbal text of tragedy, what sort of argument he is trying to put with primacy of plot, what sort of argument he is trying to point out about success and failure of action, what sort of argument he is taking that whether the tragedy is possible without plot or it is impossible without plot, what sort of analysis Aristotle is trying to bring out, what sort of things Aristotle is trying to point out, because later on Aristotle moved towards the plot and the basic things in plot. And that's why it is essential, my friends, to remember the six constituents continuously with with the phrase that Aristotle used right from the beginning of this poetics, that there are things of necessary or probable, because everything, every action lies on this necessary or probable. And that's why we have to understand certain things when we lead to the discussion that Aristotle is trying to put forth with the part of tragedy, with the plot, with the various elements of tragedy. He is trying to bring out all those things in this text. So we need to remind, we need to remember again and again few of the words. Don't forget the word called techne, what it means by techne, what is the importance of techne, why techne is the most important part of Aristotle's poetics. The second important concept we talked about is imitation, and what this important concept imitation is means by, and what imitation is in poetry, why, what this imitation leads towards, what this imitations move further, how this imitation from poetry pointed out towards drama, and how tragedy is being appeared with the help of poetic imitation. So we have to remember the poetic imitation. We have to remember the concept of technique, the concept of imitation, the development of the history of poetry, that how poetry has been transferred from different forms, and when it reached to its peak is converted into drama. It has been pointed out with the narration that appears in poetry, especially in epic poetry, that chorus leader is singing and chorus is responding. This develops a possibility of dialogue, and when there is a possibility of dialogue, it is converted into drama, and then this drama is having its own different constituents altogether. And that's why Aristotle is pointing out that this poetry is taking you up to the pointing out towards the action, and action is part of drama, action is part of tragedy. Why it is tragedy? Because tragedy is the poetic imitation, and tragedy is the refined form of poetic imitation. And that's why Aristotle is talking about tragedy. And in tragedy, Aristotle pointed out, gave us different constituents, of which the six constituents we discussed in today's lecture. We are going to continue this, what are the different parameters that Aristotle has put forth for this poetry, what sort of different parameters Aristotle has sought for this discussion to carry on in his analysis of tragedy. We'll continue this in tomorrow's lecture. I'm not going it very fast, hope so that you can able to understand it comfortably. I hope that you are getting it. I hope that you are understanding it. Thank you very much, my friends, for this lecture.